From their earliest childhood, expressions such as race and National Socialism or cremation resonated in their homes. The greeting, Heil mein Führer. It even became his morning greeting on some occasions, and for many, they were his first words. The children of the main Nazi leaders grew up immersed in the military doctrine and principles of the Third Reich, always isolated from outside reality, captives of an anti-Semitic and monstrous regime. In today's video, we are going to share with you the stories of the descendants of some of the most important figures in Germany during World War II. We will try to explore what the life and upbringing of a group of children who used to call the fearsome German Führer Uncle Adolf was like. Welcome once again to military history. Until the dramatic end of World War II, Adolf Hitler's private residence served as the epicenter of the most crucial meetings of the fervent Nazi Party. However, he not only received dignitaries and senior officials for political reasons, but more relaxed meetings were held that revealed the more human side of the Führer. These moments were usually organized by Eva Braun, his wife, known only to the tyrant's inner circle. Among these evenings, the most recurrent were those with the visit of the Schneider couple, Erwin and Hertha Schneider. These two were regular figures every week at the gatherings at the Berghof, the Führer's second government residence and resting place. Hertha, a close friend of Eva Braun since childhood, maintained an indestructible trust and loyalty with her. The Schneiders fit perfectly with the National Socialist vision of Hitler and Braun, forming a family that many aspired to emulate. Wherever they went, they took with them two little girls whom they presented as their daughters. The eldest, named Ursula, but known simply as Uschi, used to run around the wide terraces of the Berghof, even mingling among important visitors who arrived to discuss official matters with the Führer. The relationship between little Ursula and the Hitler couple drew powerful attention. To understand this story, we must go back to 1938, when Eva Braun took one of her trips through Europe, specifically to Italy. It is speculated that, on that trip, the woman was supposedly pregnant by the Führer, and she secretly gave birth to Ursula. By prior agreement, the girl was registered with the surname Schneider to be cared for by this friendly couple, with the purpose of preserving her from the dangers associated with her being the Führer's daughter. Furthermore, the plan sought at that time to keep Hitler's relationship with Eva Braun hidden and to demonstrate that he was only married to his beloved nation. In the photographs and filming of Hitler and Ursula, a special relationship was revealed that raised suspicions. In all the captured images, you can see a less rigid and more human Hitler. It is speculated that only the little girl was capable of awakening that apparently non-existent facet of his personality. Eva Braun was the one who recorded the majority of these images, showing the duo in family scenes, meetings with friends, and playing with SS agents near the Alpine residence. With the defeat of Germany and the subsequent side of Eva Braun and Hitler, the trace of the little girl was lost. But the most skeptical held the conspiracy theory that Ursula was indeed the daughter of the most powerful couple in Nazi Germany. However, specialist historians maintain that the hypothesis is nothing more than a conjecture and that Adolf Hitler left no descendants in this world. The one who did father creatures was Heinrich Himmler, one of the most sinister characters in history. He was the commander-in-chief of the SS and one of the most prominent Nazi leaders. His macabre fame is largely attributed to his role as the chief architect of the Holocaust, being responsible for the creation and oversight of the concentration camp system. However, Himmler's dark shadow extends even beyond his own life, revealing a surprising secret through his daughter, Gudrun Burwitz. Born on August 8, 1929, Gudrun was shaped from childhood by Nazi ideals. The image of her, even as a child, was used as propaganda by fitting into the concept of the Aryan race. Testimonies from prisoners claim to have seen her walking through concentration camps with her father. However, everything changed drastically in 1945, when the world she knew fell apart the moment the Nazis lost the war. After Himmler's suicide at the end of World War II, Gudrun had to testify at the Nuremberg trials. Released in 1946 after her statement, this fervent follower of Nazism decided to alter her father's perception. "I want to try to change his image," she stated in the only interview she gave. From adorable little girl to Nazi fanatic, Gudrun Berwitz played a leading role in Stille Hilfe, a secret organization that provided support to former Nazi members, fugitives, convicts, and their families. This entity, to this day, remains one of the most controversial organizations in post-war Germany. Gudrun died in May 2018 at the age of 88, adopting her husband's surname to avoid the social condemnation linked to her father's. Recognized in Germany as a fervent supporter of neo-fascist ideology, her far-right thinking earned her the title Nazi Princess. However, after his death, an unknown fact about his life was revealed. During the 60s, he worked in the Federal Intelligence Service, leaking information for American spies, a facet of his existence that he kept secret to avoid the accusation of betrayal by his Nazi friends. Another Nazi father was Joseph Goebbels, the master of propaganda and central figure of the Third Reich. Born in 1897, Goebbels emerged as one of Adolf Hitler's closest collaborators, playing a crucial role in promoting and consolidating the regime. With his eloquence and ability to manipulate the masses through the media, Goebbels became the architect of the Nazi propaganda machine. Part of this was to generate a family model for which the Nazi hierarchs competed, as we see in this fragment. His wife, Magda Goebbels, was considered the queen of the Third Reich. In this woman's body, everything that the German totalitarian system expected from a wife and mother was condensed. A devotion to caring for a husband dedicated to the growth of the nation and to raising the little ones who were going to become the superior race. A devoted fanatic of the Nazi cause and her Führer, Magda was willing to take her Aryan way of seeing the world with her husband to the ultimate consequences. It was for this reason that the defeat in 1945 led to a catastrophe for the family. Hiding with her husband in Hitler's secret refuge in the days of the fateful defeat, she made the decision to end her life alongside the two men who had left a deep mark on her existence, her husband and the Führer. When German failure seemed inevitable, in the bunker where they awaited the imminent outcome, Magda confessed to KlLLED, the Chancellor's personal secretary, some shocking words that would remain recorded in history. "Oh, it is better that my children die than that they live in shame and disgrace. Our children have no place in a Germany like the one that will come after the war." On May 1, 1945, after repeatedly rejecting the opportunity to escape with her children, Magda Goebbels made a chilling decision. Her pessimistic and cruel outlook on her future convinced her to prepare her 6 children, 5 girls and 1 boy, for death. She and her husband instructed the SS dentist, Helmut Kunz, to administer morphine to the children to put them to sleep so they could insert a vial of cyanide between their teeth. Magda herself took it upon herself to make them swallow the poison, ending her young lives and becoming a Nazi mother par excellence, devoted and murderous. Then, she ingested the same deadly cyanide she had used to poison the children, while Joseph Goebbels shot himself in the head, exchanging the last look with his wife. With that bloody and inexplicable act, the offspring of Joseph Goebbels ended. However, Magda did manage to leave a seed on this earth, Harold Quandt, son of her first marriage to billionaire Günther Quandt. This young man, impregnated with Nazi fever from his mother, joined the German army and rose to lieutenant in the Luftwaffe. He was captured by the Allies in Italy near the end of the war. After his release in 1947, Harold resumed his life as a civilian with the support of his paternal family, although marked by his past. He assumed responsibility for the businesses of the Quandt Group, one of the largest business empires in West Germany, ranging from the textile and pharmaceutical industries to the BMW brand. His life came to an end in 1967 in a tragic airplane accident. His 4 daughters, also descendants of Magda Goebbels, inherited an impressive fortune, carrying with them their family's complex legacy into post-war history. First story that we will learn next is that of Philippe Sands, a prominent lawyer and writer. This man decided to make a documentary film that would address the different perspectives held by relatives of relatives who served in the Third Reich. My Nazi Legacy, the title of the film released in 2015, delves into the complex and emotional terrain of the children of 2 prominent Nazi leaders. The filmmaker begins a journey with 2 men whose fathers played key roles in Adolf Hitler's regime. On the one hand, there is Nicholas Frank, son of Hans Frank, the Governor-General of occupied Poland during World War II, who faithfully accompanied the Führer's final solution. On the other, we find Horst von Wechter, son of Otto von Wechter, senior Nazi official and governor of Galicia, a Nazi as fanatical as Frank Sr. As the narrative unfolds, the documentary offers an intimate look through deep conversations and revealing encounters. Nicholas Frank, with a direct confrontation attitude, condemns his father's war crimes. The German, without any hesitation, maintains that his father should have been sentenced to hanging for his atrocities. His position is clear: the truth must prevail over the filial relationship. On the other hand, Horst von Wechter is torn between loyalty and love for the memory of his father, and the difficult acceptance of the uncomfortable truth surrounding Otto von Wechter's actions. Plus, let's listen to Nicholas talking about his father and the Germans.
I wrote a book against my father called The Father Revenge. I wrote it because of the silence in Germany. The Germans built a lot of monuments for their victims, yes, because it was politically correct. But the silent majority of the Germans never acknowledged the crimes between 33 and 45, which the Germans committed. I think we are people without empathy.
The film not only delves into the personal lives of these men, but raises profound questions about responsibility and the inheritance of a dark past. What are the complexities of reconciling family legacy with historical truth? It is still interesting that 2 children, in a very similar position, have such conflicting positions. One, capable of condemning his own father to hanging, while the other defends his ideals and beliefs, despite being conflicted by the sinister methodologies applied to achieve that end. Although the conclusion seems simple, we are talking about how a son relates to a father who was a war criminal and who committed and endorsed mass murders, racial exterminations, and looting of defenseless communities. Hermann Göring, colossal figure of the Third Reich and prominent leader of the Nazi Party, wove a dark legacy as commander of the German Luftwaffe during World War II. Appointed successor to Adolf Hitler, his fanatical devotion to the regime marked him as a bloodthirsty figure. After the war in Nuremberg, he was tried in the trial for war crimes and crimes against humanity. When he was informed of his conviction, he chose the way out of cowardice. The night before he was to face his sentence by hanging, he took cyanide, ending his life and fleeing his fate. Etta Göring, born June 2, 1938, was the only daughter of Hermann Göring and his second wife, the actress Emmy Sonnemann. The fact that she was Hitler's goddaughter practically turned her into a princess of the Third Reich. From her birth, Etta was a national celebrity, growing up on the opulent Karen Hall estate, filled with valuable works of art and a children's play palace. Her godfather inspired national celebrations in honor of her birthday. Etta's life, ostensibly a fairy tale, was overshadowed by the dark legacy of her father. Throughout her life, Etta defended the heritage of her father, battling against social condemnation of a family history that indelibly marked an entire nation. Her death on December 21, 2018 at the age of 80 was not publicly disclosed by her relatives because they did not want to suffer punishment from society. Whenever a Nazi loses his life, there is a part of the European people that feels a little relief inside. There was an even more unseemly curiosity for Etta Goering. She was buried discreetly in Munich in an unmarked grave, a choice motivated by the dark weight of her paternal inheritance. Rolf Mengele, son of the sadistic Nazi doctor Joseph Mengele, always saw himself as an ordinary child. Although his destiny led him to be born in Germany in 1944, during the last days of Nazism, in his childhood, this seemed to be just a curious fact. At the age of 10, he was enjoying a happy life in Germany and received sporadic letters from who he assumed was his Uncle Fritz. Since he had never met his father, whose mother told him that he was a hero missing in action, Rolf developed a deep affection for his uncle. It wasn't until he was 12 in 1956 when two shocking revelations shook his world. The first was that, contrary to what he thought, his real father was Joseph Mengele, responsible for cruel scientific experiments on prisoners at Auschwitz. The second piece of news was that Fritz's uncle, to whom he had written countless letters, was actually Mengele himself. With the truth exposed, the cruelty of his schoolmates was unleashed, who showed no mercy and hurled insults at him such as, "Your father is a criminal, little Nazi," or SS Mengele. Once aware of the true identity of his father, Rolf experienced Joseph's attempts to rebuild a father-son relationship with him. However, time and ideological differences had irreparably distanced them. Despite this, Rolf agreed to have one last meeting with his father in Sao Paulo, Brazil, where the Nazi doctor was exiled. There he witnessed the decline of his mother. The proud SS assassin had become a fearful old man, obsessed with hiding to avoid being condemned. Although Rolf demanded explanations about the Holocaust, he only got evasive answers. Let's listen to the bloodthirsty scientist's own son tell it in the first person.
Here, as I told you, he exploded, hearing this as a question from their son to him. In the sense, how can you imagine that this is possible for me to do these things? Don't you see at the first line this is a lie or propaganda or I don't know why.
Rolf Mengele always carried the shame of two atrocities endorsed by his father: the murders and the bloody medical experiments carried out in the Auschwitz concentration camp. The story of Mengele's clinical trials with prisoners is truly terrifying. For purely illustrative purposes, we tell you that the Nazi researcher had focused his obsession on studying twins, multiplying the study possibilities in the event of the death of one of them. After the death of his father in 1979, Rolf Mengele lived in silence, by order of the family clan who were the last living relatives of the macabre researcher. But that was until 1985. That year, the boy decided to share his story with the press, assuming the cost of permanently breaking the relationship with his paternal side of the family. With a clear conscience, he changed his surname to Genkel so that his children would not carry the weight of his ancestor. He spoke again in 2008, asking for forgiveness from the Jewish community, in search of identity and redemption. Martin Bormann was Hitler's private secretary and head of the chancellery. He was one of the Führer's seconds in command, an extremely trusted man. So much so that his firstborn, with the same name as his father, was Hitler's godson, and they privately joked that he was one of the possible aspirants to the throne of the Third Reich once he was older and the Nazis will dominate the earth. In the tumultuous years of his youth, Martin Bormann was a rebellious and elusive boy. Convinced that his son needed to be tamed, his parents sent him to a Nazi boarding school feared even by parents of young people affiliated with Nazism. On the shores of Lake Starnberg in Bavaria, this educational bastion was built with the mission of forging the future leaders of the Reich through uncompromising war discipline, paramilitary training, and challenging physical training. Memorizing the Hitler Youth Program and poring over the Führer's Mein Kampf were daily rituals. After the war, at just 15 years old, Martin returned to his home, dressed in his uniform with the swastika marking his arm. The house was completely empty and uninhabited, His mother had run away with a false last name, while his father had disappeared without a trace. Abandoned and helpless, Martin ran into a pastor who took him in, awakening in him a religious vocation. He embraced the life of priest and teacher, moving away from the shadows of his past. However, in 2011, darkness returned to his life when he was accused of mistreatment and sexual abuse of students. Hiding behind an alleged senile dementia, he evaded trial and conviction. Finally, on March 11, 2013, Martin Alfred Bormann, who was a claimant to the throne of the Third Reich, found his last breath unpunished, as did his father. While it is true that children are not responsible for the actions of their parents, many of the figures we explore in today's chapter claimed responsibility for the sinister actions of their parents. It is for this reason that memory and awareness of the atrocities that occurred are exercises that Germans are forced to carry out daily, so that Nazi ideology does not reign again on European soil. How would you react if you found out that your father was involved in the regime that carried out many of humanity's most cruel acts, or even worse, that he was a key figure in its operation? Fortunately, for most of us, that question is simply a hypothetical exercise, but some people had to face that situation and deal with it every day of their lives. Marked by a legacy impossible to erase, the ways to react to such a discovery span the entire spectrum of human emotions. Today, in this new episode of Military History, we'll tell you all about the children of the Third Reich's leaders and how those crimes affected their lives. If you were to have a Nazi father, one of the most understandable reactions you could have is to want to sever any kind of connection with him. This is the case of Ricardo Eichmann, the youngest son of Adolf Eichmann. The latter was an SS officer and one of the main organizers of the Holocaust, which resulted in the deaths of approximately 7 million people. He was known as the architect of the Holocaust, responsible for the deportation of hundreds of thousands of Jews to concentration camps. He oversaw the transportation of Jews from Hungary, and by the time the transport ceased, over 400,000 Hungarian Jews had been forcibly deported. Their primary destination was the Auschwitz complex, where the vast majority were murdered. Understandably, Ricardo Eichmann wanted no relationship with his father. He did not grant interviews to journalists and distanced himself from any responsibility for his father's crimes, though he never denied them. In stark contrast, Adolf Eichmann's two older sons, Horst and Klaus, defended their father until his death and even followed in his footsteps. Eichmann, who had fled to Argentina after the end of the war, was captured by Mossad agents and taken to Israel for trial. His older sons attempted through various means to secure his return, even founding the Argentine National Socialist Front for this purpose. After Eichmann's famous conviction and execution in 1962, this party set aside its political facade and engaged in anti-communist criminal activities. It ended up being absorbed by the infamous Taquara nationalist movement, a neo-Nazi group that carried out terrorist acts on Argentine soil. In this way, Eichmann's older sons always argued for their father's innocence. Any crime committed, they said, was a consequence of obedience to a superior. We will see that this is not the only case where this occurs. Below, you can see a small part of the trial that led the architect of the Holocaust to his death sentence.
Als ich das erste Mal tote Menschen, tote Juden gesehen habe, war ich erschüttert gewesen. Und diese Reaktion auf meine Nerven hat seit der Zeit kein Ende mehr gefunden. Es wirkte weiter. Ich habe meine Arbeit nach dem eisernen Muss getan, das mir auferlegt worden ist. Ich bin beeindruckt durch dieses Geschehen, das ich sehen musste, verhalten gewesen, meinem Chef mehrmals zu bitten, er möge mich endlich um Gottes Willen davon entbinden.
As you can imagine, there were other similar cases of children defending the abominable actions of their parents. Hermann Göring, one of the key players of Nazism, was the leader of the Luftwaffe almost from its birth until the end of the regime, as well as the creator of the Gestapo, the official secret police of the National Socialist Party. With this force, and together with the SS, he planned and carried out the political purge known as the Night of the Long Knives, where almost 100 members of the Nazi Party opposed to Hitler's leadership were murdered. Thousands more were arrested with the excuse of preventing an alleged internal coup d'etat. As if that were not enough, Göring was also involved in the deportation of people to concentration camps, mainly Soviet prisoners of war. All this did not stop his daughter Edda from defending him throughout her life. Goddaughter of Adolf Hitler himself, Edda always maintained the idea that her father was innocent. According to her, the problem had been his unconditional loyalty to the Führer. These were her words. Göring had sworn personal loyalty to her and would never abandon her, even when Hitler had gone too far. The things that happened to the Jews were horrible, but quite separate from my father. Despite her words, Edda attended funerals of former leaders of the Third Reich and political events sponsored by neo-Nazi parties. She also wanted to keep the priceless works of art looted or illegally obtained by Göring during the war, but unanimously the German government rejected her request. You can hear her warmly remembering her father.
Mein Vater liebte es, jedem Einzelnen einen Gabentisch herzurichten. Hatte sich ganze Listen dafür zusammengestellt, die zum Teil heute noch existieren. Unsere Angestellten feierten, wie gesagt, mit uns, da die Eltern sie als ihre Freunde betrachteten. Dafür haben sie uns auch eine rührende Treue bewiesen, obwohl sie zum Teil wegen ihrer Zugehörigkeit zum Hause Göring nach Kriegsende viel durchzumachen hatten. Ich bin heute noch mit einigen von ihnen in Verbindung und sie sprechen nach wie vor mit großer Zuneigung und Verehrung von meinen Eltern.
Other relatives of the Luftwaffe leader did not follow his daughter's example. Bettina and Peter Göring, his great-nephews, decided to make a drastic decision. At the age of 30, they underwent surgery to become sterile. Thus, according to them, no one else would carry on the dark legacy of the Görings. Both acknowledged the crimes of their great-uncle and dedicated their lives to raising awareness about the Holocaust. Now let's see what happened with the daughter of Heinrich Himmler, who did not have a very different reaction from Edda Göring's. Remember that Himmler was the head of the armed branch of the SS and one of the main architects of the Holocaust. He formed the death squads, responsible for the mass murder of millions of people, and administered numerous concentration camps. Captured by the Allies shortly after the end of the war in Europe, he preferred to commit suicide rather than face trial. After Hitler, Himmler is often remembered as one of the most ruthless members of Nazism. His daughter was Gudrun Himmler, better known by the nickname Puppy. Like Eichmann's elder children, Gudrun was openly neo-Nazi, joining an underground organization that helped former SS members escape justice. She even donated money for the defense of some war criminals, such as Klaus Barbie, a senior SS officer known as the Butcher of Lyon. Remember this name, because we will talk about him again later. Puppy worked for the West German intelligence service until the 1960s, when she was dismissed along with other Nazi party members. Until her last breath, Gudrun denied the Holocaust and absolved her father of any crime he had been accused of. It is clear that, as the saying goes, the apple does not fall far from the tree. Let's move on to the case of another of Adolf Hitler's godchildren, the eldest son of Martin Bormann. Bormann was one of the most powerful figures within the Nazi Party, serving as head of the party chancellery and personal secretary to the Führer. In fact, after the dictator's suicide, he succeeded him as the party's top authority for a few days. This allows us to assert, with absolute certainty, that he was the second most important Nazi after Hitler himself. For many other German leaders, the secretary was an incredibly dangerous person, as he wielded great influence over the Führer. He was a fervent anti-Semite and advocated for the persecution, mistreatment, and death of Catholics, Jews, and Slavs within the areas conquered by Germany. Bormann committed suicide on May 2, 1945, when the Soviets had already reached Berlin, although his body was found years later. Until it was confirmed that the remains belonged to him, one of the most speculated hypotheses was that Bormann had escaped and was hiding in Argentina, like many of his compatriots. Let's see an interview from the year 1972 with one of the individuals tasked with finding the Nazi who was convinced of this theory.
Según mi entendimiento, que Martin Bormann pasó por la República después de la Segunda Guerra Mundial en 1948 es seguro y es indiscutible. No puedo opinar si vive todavía o pasó o vivió recientemente en la República Argentina, eso no puedo contestar.
Everything seemed to indicate that his son, Martin Adolf Bormann, would follow in his father's footsteps within the party. Referred to by several Nazi leaders as KlLLED, which means Crown Prince, he was sent as a young boy to a Nazi boarding school in Bavaria, an institution where future party leaders were sought to be molded. It was a strict place. At 13, he was already forced to undergo military training, to read and study Mein Kampf, the famous book written by the Führer, and to learn the doctrine of the Nazi Party until it was ingrained in his mind. After Hitler's death, with his parents missing, he had to fend for himself until he could take refuge on a farm. There, he began to learn about the crimes of the party to which he belonged. A few years later, he turned fully to religion, perhaps seeking to rid himself of the guilt he felt. He became a priest, going as a missionary to war-torn areas of Africa. For almost his entire adult life, he dedicated himself to spreading awareness and informing the population about the crimes committed by the Nazis, including those of his father. However, according to him, he could never stop loving his progenitor, even going so far as to say the following: "I do not hate him. For many years, I learned to differentiate between my father as an individual and my father as a Nazi politician and officer." Now let's see what happened with the descendants of Albert Speer, a German architect who served as Minister of Armaments and War Production during World War II. For many years, Speer was considered something of a good Nazi, meaning a normal man surrounded by monsters, overwhelmed by circumstances, and forced to act against his true nature. He stated that despite being aware of the crimes committed by other members of the Third Reich, he did not know the extent of the atrocities, particularly regarding the Holocaust. During the Nuremberg trials, he was sentenced to 20 years in prison for his role in the war. Recently, Speer's version began to be controversial, as evidence emerged that he was fully aware of the forced labor to which prisoners and civilians were subjected during the war. His own son, Albert Speer Jr., supported this revision, as he recognized his father's crimes from a young age and distanced himself from his legacy. Along with Martin Adolf Bormann and the youngest son of Adolf Eichmann, he created an organization to help victims of Nazism. Very different from the examples we have seen so far is the case of the son of Hans Frank. Known as the Butcher of Poland, Hans Frank was the Governor-General of the occupied territories of this country, from its invasion by Germany until the collapse of his government in early 1945. During his tenure, the Polish population was constantly terrorized by his methods. These involved segregating Jews from the region and forcing them to perform forced labor, killing anyone who dared to resist. Additionally, he oversaw the Warsaw Ghetto and 4 concentration camps. During his time in power, 4 million people were murdered under his jurisdiction. After the war, he was found guilty in the Nuremberg trials and sentenced to death. Based on the examples we've seen so far, we might think that Hans Frank's son would feel some sort of sympathy for his father, regardless of how ruthless his actions were. But this is not the case. Ever since the magnitude of his father's crimes became known, Nicholas Frank has denounced his father on every possible occasion, writing books about it and participating in documentaries. He once said that he carried a photo of his father dead on the gallows in his wallet for many years. On one occasion, when asked about his father, he said the following: "I no longer hate him, I just despise him." You can see him below talking about him.
And here's the King of Poland, my father, on the tower of the Wawel Castle. And this I hate especially, this picture.
Why?
Yes, because at this direction was the ghetto, at this direction was concentration camp, down in the streets, everywhere, the SS guards, and he was pretending here to be a peaceful, far-looking statesman. He knew exactly what he really was, the governor of on a sea of blood.
Before we move on to our last example, we should mention something. All the cases we saw so far showed us how these sons and daughters of Nazis dealt with the heavy legacy of their parents during their lives after the war, but some did not have that opportunity. Joseph Goebbels, one of the most infamous leaders of the Third Reich, does not need much of an introduction. He was Minister of Propaganda, a close collaborator of Hitler, and a violent anti-Semite. He managed the information coming out of Germany, manipulating the truth to favor the interests of the party, and even encouraged Hitler to adopt increasingly extreme measures against the population they considered inferior. In 1945, Goebbels, his wife Magda, and his 6 children were in Hitler's underground bunker when the Red Army arrived in Berlin. Seeing that defeat was inevitable, Goebbels and his wife decided to commit suicide and take their children to the grave. First, they injected them with morphine to make them unconscious, and then they crushed a cyanide vial in each of their mouths. According to some witnesses, the Goebbels did not want their children to grow up hearing that their father had been one of the greatest criminals of the century. Below, we can see a historian talking about this dark moment.
Goebbels, I would argue, did something that people who are in psychotic depression do when they commit suicide. They have a tendency to take their wives and children with them, because in their minds the future is so horribly black. There's no hope in the future. Such horrible punishment is coming that I'm going to save my children the agony that they're going to be put through because they're my children.
The couple claimed that, had they been old enough, the children would have supported the decision. At the time of their deaths, they were 12, 11, 9, 8, 6, and 4 years old. As you can see, for some, the actions and crimes of their parents weighed heavily on their conscience. For others, they cost them their lives. The last case we're going to talk about is that of Sword Chalandon. Chalandon is a famous writer and journalist born in Tunisia who covered numerous events in the Middle East. He also investigated and was present at the trial of the aforementioned Klaus Barbie, the Butcher of Lyon, a Nazi officer responsible for torturing French prisoners of the Gestapo in that city. Chalandon's father asked his son to include him as a spectator in the trial. The elderly man had always claimed to be a member of the French resistance, so his son assumed he wanted the satisfaction of seeing one of the Nazis responsible for so much suffering being judged. But during the trial, his father had curious attitudes. He seemed to smile when Barbie spoke and looked upset when the resistance members did. Until his adolescence, Chalandon had complete trust in his father. He had never questioned his words, not even when he claimed to have been the head of French intelligence, or when he narrated a supposed romantic disagreement with the famous French singer Edith Piaf. After Barbie's trial,
Después del juicio de Barbie, Chalandon y su padre no volvieron a hablar de la guerra hasta el año en que el anciano
he
murió.
confessed the truth. He had never been a French partisan. In fact, he had been a member of the SS, fought on the Soviet front, and even was one of the last defenders of Hitler's bunker in Berlin. The truth Chalandon believed he knew collapsed in the blink of an eye. But this is not the end of the story. In 2020, his brother sent him a dossier from a French prison that showed that when the war in Europe ended, their father had been imprisoned there, so it was impossible for him to have been in Berlin defending the Führer's bunker. Even on the verge of death, he chose to keep lying. Chalandon wasted no time in uncovering more truths about his father. He had enlisted in the French army, but when he saw they were close to defeat, he deserted. He then joined the Tricolor Legion of Vichy's collaborating France, but deserted again when its members were sent to fight on the Soviet front. Captured by the German army, he was recruited into the Motorized Corps, a Nazi paramilitary organization responsible for transporting troops to the front. To the surprise of few, he deserted again and surrendered to the French resistance. He stayed with them until, while in Belgium, he abandoned them to find the Germans. Unfortunately for him, he was captured by American troops, who didn't believe his words and sent him to the French army, which imprisoned him for a year. He met Chalandon's
Conoció
mother
a la
in
madre de
Tunisia,
Chalandon
to
en
whom he
Túnez,
claimed he was
a
a
quien le
secret
dijo
agent.
que era un agente
As the
secreto.
journalist says,
Según dice
I
el
don't judge the
periodista,
young man who got
yo no
lost during
juzgo
the
al
war,
joven que se
but the
perdió
lying
durante
father
la
who lied to
guerra,
me and my
sino
family
al
and
padre
destroyed us.
mentiroso que me
Not the
mintió a mí y a
collaborator,
mi
but the bastard
familia y
who
nos
left us without
destruyó.
memory, without
No al
anything.
colaboracionista,
You can see him
sino al
talking about his
bastardo
father.
que nos dejó sin memoria, sin nada. Lo puedes ver hablando sobre su padre.
Et mon grand-père m'avait dit un jour, il faut que tu saches plusieurs choses. D'abord, ton père, il avait choisi le mauvais camp pendant la guerre, le mauvais camp. La deuxième chose, c'est qu'il avait vu, nous sommes de Lyon, il avait vu habillé en allemand à Lyon. Et la troisième chose, il me dit, tu vois, un jour, il était extrêmement énervé, il me dit, n'importe comment, il faut que tu le saches. Tu es un enfant de salaud.
So you can see that the reactions of these sons and daughters are tremendously varied. The feelings of those who couldn't separate their affection for their parents from their appalling actions during the Third Reich are understandable, although not justifiable because of it. However, the weight of the evidence left by history tends to undermine even the most stubborn denial. If not for them, at least for us. April 1945. Berlin is in flames. Even so, the faithful followers of Nazism continue to follow orders until the end. Joseph Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda, accompanies Hitler until his last moment. But after his leader decides to take his own life, he feels that it is not worth staying in this world and follows in the footsteps of the Führer. In a desperate and tragic act, he drags his wife, Magda, and his 6 innocent children into a spiral of death and destruction. The Red Army advances steadily towards the city center. The Soviet soldiers go after Hitler's head, but they will not be able to get it. The remains of the Nazi leaders are burned by the few occupants who remain in the bunker. The only thing that Stalin's men find in their conquest is a pile of incinerated corpses. Faced with this brutal scene, only one question arises: what to do with them? In this new military history video, we will learn the fate of the Goebbels, the fearsome Joseph, his wife Magda, and the couple's 6 children. We will discover what happened to their bodies at the end of World War II and in the decades following the defeat of Nazism. Get ready for a chilling installment.
Ob du diesen Brief erhältst, weiß ich nicht. Unsere Idee geht zugrunde und mit ihr all das, was ich Schönes und Gutes in meinem Leben gekannt habe. Die Welt, die nach dem Nationalsozialismus kommt, ist nicht mehr wert, darin zu leben.
The Second World War was marked by violent battles, millions of deaths, and some of the greatest atrocities committed by man throughout history. The persecution and extermination of the Jewish people is probably one of the most remembered. But there were also tragic endings on the German side. The strong conviction with which the Nazi leaders had lived was the same one that contributed to an abrupt and devastating fall. Adolf Hitler is the main example. The person responsible for the cruelest scenes of the conflict was cornered by the Soviets in Berlin. Desperate and with no way out, on April 30th, 1945, he decided to take his own life. Many people believe that by doing so, he was simply seeking to avoid a punishment that would make him experience part of the suffering he caused. Now, on this occasion, we will focus on a unique story, where a great difference is usually made between evil characters who deserve to die and innocent victims of the tragedy. We are talking about the Goebbels family, who stood by the Führer until the very end, demonstrating their admiration and commitment to the Nazi cause. But how did his terrible end come about? Before answering that question, we must know a little more about the main figure of the clan. This is Joseph Goebbels, one of the most influential men of the Nazi regime, known mainly for his role as Minister of Propaganda of the Third Reich. He was born on October 29, 1897 in the city of Reich, to a middle-class Catholic family. Growing up, he studied literature, history, and philosophy at various German universities, earning a doctorate in philology in 1921. Despite his academic training, he had difficulty finding a stable job, which led him to become interested in politics. It was there that he was dazzled by the charisma of a man who represented the nationalist and anti-Semitic ideas with which he himself sympathized. That person was Adolf Hitler, and Goebbels soon became one of his most loyal followers.
Sie sollen sich hüten. Einmal wird unsere Geduld zu Ende sein und dann Maul gestoppt werden! Unser Führer, der Reichskanzler Adolf Hitler, hat das Wort!
Goebbels joined the Nazi Party in 1924, and when Hitler came to power on January 30th, 1933, his loyalty ensured him a crucial place as Minister of Propaganda. He was in charge of consolidating the figure of the Führer by manipulating public opinion. This would allow the war plans and expansion of the regime to be carried out with the blind support of the German people. The methods to influence people were many, from control of the media to government participation in artistic expressions such as theater, film, or music. Through these means, they managed to create stereotypes, and among them, one of the main ones, was that of the German family. Racial purity was crucial for the Third Reich, so it encouraged the formation of marriages between Aryan people and having many children. In this framework, Goebbels himself became a model for the people thanks to his exemplary relationship with his wife and 6 children. Joseph had met his partner Magda through social circles connected to the Nazi Party in the late 1920s. The upper-class woman had previously been married to a wealthy German industrialist named Günther Quandt, with whom she already had a son, Harold. Their divorce in 1929 left Magda with a considerable fortune, making her a well-connected and well-off figure. Interested in politics and attracted by Adolf Hitler's charisma, she attended meetings of the National Socialist space, where she eventually met Goebbels. The man, who was by then already a leading member of the party, was impressed by her beauty and sophistication. A romantic relationship quickly began between them, which they sealed in December 1931 by marrying in a ceremony in which Hitler was one of the witnesses.
The Goebbels ended up having 6 children in the first 9 years of their marriage. Magda had already been pregnant when she and Joseph were wed, and in 1932 she gave birth to their first child, a daughter named Helga. 5 more children followed, 1 son and 4 more daughters. Each child's name started with an H, and it has been speculated, probably with complete accuracy, that Magda and Joseph elected to adopt this convention in an act of sycophancy towards Hitler, whose name started with H.
The couple shared a deep admiration for the Führer, which helped to keep the marriage going in times of crisis. Despite being a man deeply in love with Magda, Joseph Goebbels had several unofficial relationships with women, especially actresses. One of the most notorious episodes was his affair with the Czech Lida Barova in 1938, which almost led to a divorce. Hitler personally intervened to prevent them from separating, since the Nazi regime promoted its image as that of a perfect German family. Beyond the infidelities, the woman remained loyal to her husband and to the National Socialist cause. The relationship was sustained in part by her devotion to the Chancellor. In addition, despite the resentment over the betrayal, she understood the importance of her husband in the hierarchy of the Third Reich and was capable of sacrificing herself to stay by his side. However, Joseph was not the only one who held an important position within the structure of the regime. It is true that Magda Goebbels did not hold an official position in the government, but she played a symbolic and highly significant role. Because Hitler never married, at least until the day before his death, she was seen as the First Lady of the Third Reich by virtue of her husband's prominent position and her personal closeness to the Führer. She was a figure with great presence and taken into account by the hierarchy. She publicly represented the ideal of the German woman, mother, wife, and defender of Nazi values. Her 6 children, blonde and well cared for, appeared in photographs and at events. They were also presented as the idealized image of a perfect Aryan family, which sought to reinforce the theories of a racial purity that made them superior. Without a doubt, Magda became a significant figure, and to a large extent it was also due to a close relationship with Hitler, whom she considered a father. She was absolutely devoted to him and his plans. This closeness influenced many of her decisions and placed her as one of the most fervent defenders of Nazism until the last days of the regime, so much so that after the Führer's departure, she did something hard to believe.
Hitler committed suicide to avoid the humiliation of being captured. Only a day earlier, the Führer had named Joseph Goebbels to be his successor as Chancellor of Germany.
Der Goebbels hat sich verabschiedet von seinen Leuten und hat, wie gesagt, dem Telefonisten die Hand gegeben, was nie gemacht hatte vorher, und hat ihm tief in die Augen geblickt und gesagt, wir haben verstanden zu leben und so werden wir auch verstehen zu sterben. So, das hat gesagt als faktisch letzte Worte.
We return to the starting point of our video and find ourselves in April 1945. Soviet forces surrounded Berlin and advanced fiercely towards the Führer bunker, Adolf Hitler's refuge beneath the German Chancellery building. The Nazi leader decided not to fall into the hands of the Red Army and took his own life together with his new wife, Eva Braun. Joseph and Magda, along with other high-ranking Nazis who were also in the bunker, were informed of their leader's suicide. At that moment, the Goebbels immediately made the chilling decision to follow the Führer once again. Faithful to the end, the couple began preparations for the most difficult task of their hasty plan, murdering their 6 children.
The most appalling and evil decision that any parent can make, and that is to murder their children.
They couldn't imagine any purpose in living or in having their children live in a world without Adolf Hitler and without National Socialism.
For 21 years, Goebbels was devoted to Hitler and the Nazi Party. It was his life, it was his everything. In many ways, it was love, the worst kind of love, an obsessional lust for pure evil.
The 6 children had been moved into the bunker weeks earlier, as the Soviets advanced inexorably toward Berlin. Other Nazi leaders there tried to convince the Goebbels to send them to a safer, more remote location, but the couple refused, even though they knew that staying in the city during those days was a mortal risk. Helga, the eldest, was already 12 years old and understood in part what was happening. Seeing the worried faces of the adults, she realized that she was being lied to about the outcome of the war. She was followed by Hilda, 11 years old, Helmut, 9, Hulda, 8, Hedwig, 6, and little Heidrun, barely 4 years old. Some accounts of that moment in the Führer bunker suggest that the children's childlike innocence sowed a certain doubt in Joseph Goebbels before he went ahead with the plan. However, Magda was fully convinced to go ahead, and she was the one in charge of carrying it out. A letter sent to Harold Quandt, her eldest son from her first marriage, made her thoughts completely clear. That note, written in April 1945, and with the certainty that the end was near, said, "It is not worth living in the world that is coming after the Führer. That is why I have also taken the children, because the life they would lead after us would be painful. A merciful God will understand me when I myself give them salvation." There she explained the reason why she had taken the children to the bunker. Her idea of killing them if she lost the war was not something improvised. She felt that in this way she would prevent them from being raised in the decadence of a post-Nazi society. On May 1, 1945, one day after Hitler's death, the plan was initiated. At around 8:40 p.m., Magda Goebbels asked SS dentist Helmut Kuntz to help her administer morphine to the children. This way they would be unconscious and not suffer what was to come. Although Kuntz agreed to the first request, he refused to continue with the next stage, so the one who accompanied the woman from then on was the Nazi doctor Ludwig Stumpfegger. Together they introduced capsules with a high dose of cyanide into the mouths of each child, manipulating their jaws to bite and swallow the deadly poison. Still locked in the level where the children's rooms were, Magda became aware of what she had done. There was no turning back.
After the children had been killed, she then went to the Führer bunker and looked very pale and her face was frozen. But now it was time for Magda and Goebbels to go the same way as her children and Hitler.
The couple had committed their last crime. The genocide in which they had been complicit by accompanying Hitler could only be crowned with an act as brutal as killing their own children. The war was lost, their leader had taken his own life, and they had no choice but to put an end to their story. They wrote several farewell letters, and shortly after midnight, they went out into the garden of the Reich Chancellery. Magda watched attentively as Joseph loaded his gun. They stared at each other for the last time, and the Nazi leader fired. His wife fell in front of him with a fatal wound to the head. That was the image with which he would say goodbye to this world. He immediately put the gun to his temple and pulled the trigger. Goebbels had left instructions that both should be cremated after their death, following the example of Adolf Hitler, whose remains had also been burned. His personal assistant, Günther Schweigermann, and other helpers were in charge of taking the bodies to the indicated place to carry out those orders.
Schweigermann was the one who allegedly ordered bullets to be fired into the Goebbels' lifeless bodies to ensure that he and Magda had died. The bodies of the Goebbelses were then covered with limited amounts of petrol, and they were partially burned, and then because the fuel ran out, they were left smouldering. The harrowing effect of this was that Joseph Goebbels and his wife's body were then found, and they were rather recognisable because of this.
The bodies were charred and could not be reduced to ashes, as the Nazi leader had hoped. Thus, despite efforts to leave the Soviets empty-handed, their bodies eventually became war trophies. On May 2nd, 1945, Red Army forces took the Berlin Chancellery and bunker, finding the partially burned remains in the garden. Stalin's men also found the 6 murdered children and discovered a horrendous secret. Helga, the eldest daughter, was bruised and had various signs of violence. She was supposedly still conscious when her mother and the SS doctor came to poison her. She struggled to resist and was beaten before being given cyanide and dying. After identification, the remains of the Goebbels family, along with those of Hitler, Eva Braun, and other high-ranking officials of the Third Reich, were taken to various secret locations by the Soviet authorities. The aim was to prevent them from becoming a place of worship or pilgrimage for Nazi sympathizers by leaving them in one place. Initially, as part of the process of hiding the bodies, they were buried on the grounds of a military barracks in Buch, a neighborhood in the northeast of Berlin. At this point, the Soviet intelligence service known as SMERSH sought to keep the remains under strict surveillance.
The people who moved these bodies were SMERSH agents. It was at this point that Hitler's skull was sent to Stalin, but the body of Goebbels remained underground in the Soviet complex for some time. The bodies were buried rather secretively, and it was not known who was buried close by.
Later, at some unspecified time in late 1945, the remains were exhumed from Buch and moved to Rathenau, a town in the state of Brandenburg, west of Berlin. There, they were secretly reburied in a place controlled by the Red Army. But that was not all. In February 1946, the bodies of Hitler, Goebbels, and the other members of the Nazi circle were again reburied. This time, a more remote and secure site was sought, the military base in Magdeburg, in what was then the Soviet occupation zone of East Germany. That was the last burial given to the remains of the Third Reich leaders. They were placed underground at the headquarters of Stalin's 11th Army Intelligence Unit, where they remained in an anonymous and guarded grave for more than 2 decades. Finally, in 1970, the Soviet Union decided to close the base in Magdeburg and return the land to the German authorities. Yuri Andropov, then head of the KGB, feared that the graves of Hitler and other Nazi leaders might be discovered in the future. So in March of that year, the bodies were exhumed once again.
The bodies were placed on the back of a truck. They were then driven under disguise to Schönbeck. Inside of a crematorium there, the body of Joseph Goebbels was burned, and his ashes were then hastily collected and were thrown inside of a sack.
The same thing happened with the remains of Magda Goebbels and the couple's 6 children. Then, the ashes of the entire family were scattered in a river, in an undisclosed area near Magdeburg. The entire process was kept secret for many years to prevent any trace from being used as a symbol or relic by neo-Nazi groups or admirers of the Third Reich. That was the fate of the Goebbels, from the fearsome Joseph to the cruel Magda and the innocent little ones who bore the full weight of Nazism, being dragged down by it. They all had the same tragic end. And now, after having learned their story, it is time to say goodbye. Thank you very much for having joined us. We look forward to seeing you in our next video.